Welcome to Music Forever, a podcast by the New Horizons International Music Association. I am Irene Cohen. Diane Scholfield was introduced to music when her parents bought her a piano at age 4. She thought then that she and her piano had a special language and that she was the only one who could understand that. Since then, she has tried a long list of other instruments, including the flute, percussion, acoustic guitar, trombone, and French horn. She spent many years as a vocalist singing a cappella and caroling in San Diego, including at the famous Hotel del Coronado. After a decades-long career as a writer and editor, she heard about the New Horizons Band of Carlsbad and decided to join. Diane tells a delightful story of her journey of music throughout life, her discovery of NHIMA online programming and live band camps, and her desire to possibly play a violin, a cello, or a saxophone in the future. This interview was done by Zoom in March 2024. Welcome, Diane, to Music Forever.
Thank you so much for having me.
Diane and I met in Mont-Tremblant during a band camp in Quebec, in Canada, in October of 2023. And she agreed to do an interview here via Zoom. Diane, as always, the first question that I ask people is how did music get in your life?
My parents were not musicians themselves, but they loved music. They had won a hi-fi stereo on a game show when I was only about 2 years old. And it was the most beautiful piece of furniture in our house. And of course, we needed a lot of records for it. I wanted a record, and they bought me the Boston Pops recording of Peter and the Wolf. And I loved it. I played it over and over and over and over, and I knew all the instruments, then all the voices that the instruments represented. And I have a feeling that was the foundation of what then became my lifelong love of playing music.
You are not the first person mentioning Peter and the Wolf. I think it's a generational thing. I know I grew up with it. Other people have mentioned it as well during this podcast. Was there any particular animal that you loved?
Oh, gosh, not really. I just loved that the instruments had been so carefully chosen to represent the animals. And also the hunters. The hunters were French horns, and Grandpa was a bassoon. And I felt that the instruments were very representative of what the animals might sound like and the people.
Maybe explain to people who don't know what hi-fi stereo means.
Hi-fi is short for high fidelity. And this was a record player, reel-to-reel tape recorder, and a radio that was encased in a beautiful furniture cabinet. And the way my parents won it, they were on a show called Play Your Hunch, and there were chords for various kinds of things all tangled up, and they had to pick a chord and then follow it to its end, and then they won that prize. The chord they picked led to this stereo, which, other than the piano, was the most beautiful piece of furniture in our whole house, probably.
What a truly beautiful memory for you to have. Speaking about the piano, tell us a little bit about that.
I'm the oldest in my family, and my parents were educators. Both have died now. I had my mother all to myself for 3.5 years, and I was a very inquisitive child, and my mother joked that my first word was not daddy or mommy, it was why. She was happy to devote her time to me, but when my baby brother came along, her work was probably tripled with, two kids. And of course, I didn't let up in my inquisitiveness. So I think it was a family friend who said, you might want to put her in piano lessons. So at age 4, that's what they did. And I loved it from the start. I used to think that the piano was sleeping, and that when I opened the cover and then played it, that it woke up. and started talking to me. And as a 4-year-old, this is what I truly believed. So I wanted to wake up that piano every chance I had. And so I really took to the lessons quite well.
So did you have your lessons at home?
I believe I did. I was young enough that I can't really remember, but I do remember only playing on the piano that was in our home. So I suspect that the teacher did come to our home.
Obviously, you had a very close relationship with your piano in that you were communicating with it and it was communicating with you.
I did. We moved around a lot when I was a kid. My father was a school administrator who kept getting better and better jobs. So unfortunately, every time we moved, the piano stayed behind and then we bought a new one. But I have always bonded with instruments. I joke around with friends that I talk to animals, plants, and musical instruments and make no apologies for it. I would cry and cry when we had to leave the piano behind. And my parents would say, "Oh, don't worry, we're going to buy a new piano, but it won't be this piano." So anyway, I think that was a little bit tough for me, but they always did. They always followed through and bought a new piano. And I took lessons until I was about 13.
So what happened at that point? Did you play any other instruments?
I did. When I was in 3rd grade, that was when in our school system, students could begin to play a band instrument. And of course, I wanted to do that. So I started to play flute. There were a couple of reasons why I chose that instrument. One is that I had to walk to school, and I figured that a flute case was going to be fairly easy to transport. But also it was the voice of the bird on Peter and the Wolf. So I thought that would be an instrument that I would love to learn to play. And that has become what I call my primary instrument. I have kept up with it off and on throughout my life and still play it today. In fact, it's the instrument I play at band camp.
Any particular affection? I mean, you mentioned the bird in Peter and the Wolf. Can you explain whether you have a special affection to the sound of a woodwind?
I have affection for the sound of most musical instruments. I love the flute because it has a very sweet sound, a very lilting sound, and that appeals to me. But I also love the sound of many other instruments. At the moment, I'm learning to play French horn, and I really enjoy the sound of that as well. And when I got into middle school, that would have been when I was 12 years old, there were about 5 bazillion flutes in the band, and they needed some percussion players. Well, there was a very cute boy who played snare drum, and I thought, sure, I'll play percussion. So I got switched to that section, and I had a band director who believed very much in having each person specialize in a percussion instrument. So my specialty became timpani. And then I also played crash cymbals and what we called the toys, any percussion, auxiliary instrument, triangle and tambourine and all of those. Also at age 12, I wanted to learn to play guitar, as many in my generation did. I believe the year was 1967 and folk music was very, very popular. And I listened to a lot of music by what I call the J girls. That would be Joni Mitchell and Joan Baez and Judy Collins and Carole King, who doesn't fit in as a J girl, but nevertheless. And so I wanted to play music like they did. And I begged and begged and begged for a guitar. Well, at this point, I was taking piano lessons and flute lessons, and I just switched to percussion. And my parents said, "We're not paying for guitar lessons." And I said, "That's okay. I'll teach myself." And so I did. They bought me the cheapest guitar they could find for Christmas. I went down to the music store and bought a chord dictionary. So I just picked out the chords and listened to the radio, and I took pink binder paper and wrote down the song lyrics the best I could hear them and figured out the chords, and I played it all through my teenage years and into college. It was the easiest way to make friends. And it turned out that I had a fairly good voice. And of course, anytime you practice any instrument, even a vocal instrument, you usually can get better at it and develop it. So when I started my career there was no way I was going to give up music, but I didn't have a piano anymore and I didn't have any kind of group to play my flute in. So I started finding vocal groups that I could belong to. I started with church choir and then became a church soloist and a church ensemble member. And from there, I found other opportunities. I was a singer in a big band for a while. The favorite thing I ever did, I was a member of a Christmas caroling a cappella troupe. We dressed in the Dickens style and entertained throughout San Diego, including the Hotel del Coronado. We were the resident strolling carolers at the famous Hotel del Coronado. And it was absolutely lovely. I sing alto. It was challenging and wonderful. And I do kind of joke around that a vocal instrument is pretty easy to schedule a practice with because I could sing in the car or I didn't have to take anything with me. It was just right there.
Did you have any formal vocal lessons?
No, I never did. It was just the music lessons that I had had. From that, I was able to develop a fairly good ear. And again, because I learned music when I was so young, I think that has stayed with me. I learned to read music at the same time that I was learning to read words. In fact, I thought the music was the language of the piano back when I had that vision of the piano sleeping. I thought, oh, this is a secret language and I know it and my parents don't. I was a writer and editor. Just about any way that you could write professionally, I did. I wrote for newspapers and magazines. I was a content editor for websites. I was an editor of books for a while. I love words also. Words and music, that's me.
At what point in time did you decide to get back to playing an instrument again?
Something very fortuitous. I live very near to the Museum of Making Music, which is part of NAMM, the National Association of Music Merchants. They have their headquarters in Carlsbad, which is about 10 miles from where I live. The Museum of Making Music, back in about 2001, decided to join a program, which was fairly new then from my understanding, and form a new Horizons band. I jumped all over it. There was something in the newspaper about it, and they were going to have a beginning level and as well as a band. I don't know what possessed me, but I thought, I want to learn a new instrument. So I chose trombone and went to the first session. And the director, who was also a trombone player at that time, it was a different director than I have now, he said, what a great instrument to choose for someone who is a singer, because a trombone, you need to have that slide in just the right position to be in tune. And so he thought that was a really good choice for me. So for about 2 years, I played trombone and worked my way up into the band. Then we moved to a little 2-bedroom townhouse that has neighbors in very close proximity. And my husband thought that in terms of the size of the trombone as well as the volume of it, it might be best for me to go back to a different instrument. So I donated my trombone to a school and then took up flute again.
What a very interesting comment by your trombone director. I suspect that a vocalist has a natural tendency to know where the exact pitch needs to be. With a trombone, you have that ability to adjust it with your slide.
Yes, it does. A trombone does not have any fixed positions. The slide has 7 positions, if I recall, and those are the notes. But you can put that slide anywhere along the position, and you will be out of tune if you don't get it pretty well. So I would guess that your trombone players have a very, very good ear. I'm now playing French horn. I took that up about 4 years ago and have worked my way up to playing that in our band in Carlsbad because we were short of French horn players. And so I thought, great, I'll do that. In some of the upper register, ear is also very important. We, of course, like all of the bands, had a pretty rough time during COVID. We tried to meet over Zoom and did the best we could to stick together. We also had some very small sectionals that would meet out on somebody's front porch where everybody was 20 feet apart, it seemed like. But none of that was particularly satisfying, at least as far as being together in a band. In Carlsbad, which is in San Diego County, we're very fortunate that we can play outdoors. And the NAMM headquarters, which is where we rehearse, has a parking lot that is topped by solar panels. And so when we were able to get back together, we did so outside. And I will never forget that first rehearsal. It had been about 14 months. We sat down and we started to play. And those first couple of notes, I started to cry. I'm doing it now. I can't believe this, but I realized how much playing together with people had become such an integral part of my life.
What is so special about New Horizons for you?
The reason that I love New Horizons so much is that there are no auditions. It is simply, if you think you can play and you want to play, come play. And our director has always said, if you can't play all the notes, play the notes you can. And what we find is that people, they will judge for themselves whether this is a good fit for them or not. And we do have people who come into New Horizons who are a little apprehensive. They apologize. Oh, they haven't played in so long, and, that kind of thing. And everybody in the band has been there. We do have some very good players. The camaraderie of New Horizons is the key thing. In my home band, we were playing something where there was a measure of eighth notes that were very high. And so I raised my hand and I asked the director how many other instruments were playing that same measure, those same eighth notes. And he looked at me quizzically and I said, well, it's because those are really high for me. And he said, oh, we've got flutes and oboes and alto saxes are all playing it. And so I said, okay, great, I'm going to sit this measure out. And everybody laughed. And so later I asked the director, should I have not said that? And he said, no, I'm glad that you know your limitations and you're willing to sit this out until such time as you can play that by admitting that.
It's a great example. And, I think that the laughter was coming from people who would have said, I do the same thing. Last year, the Mont Tremblant Bandcamp was advertised on the New Horizons International Music Association's website. And Diane thought, well, why don't I fly diagonally across this large continent from the very southwest to the very northeast and join? Tell us more.
One of the blessings of COVID was that I discovered New Horizons International Music Association. The international organization that governs New Horizons bands had stepped up to the plate and was offering online Zoom classes in ukulele and tin whistle and lectures about music. And gosh, I was so starved for music that I thought, this is great. So I signed up and I noticed this thing about Bandcamp. When it got announced that we were going to be in Quebec, which I have been to before, and I find it very beautiful, I signed up. In my home band, there were all the jokes about, what happens in Bandcamp stays in Bandcamp. So I was able to joke back where, when we were all in high school, we would have stayed up until 1 a.m. But I'm going to tell you, after a day of Bandcamp, you're ready for bed at 9 o'clock because it is the most fantastic musical experience I have ever had. It was so intense. I never, ever dreamed that we would be able to do the performances we did. What was it, 5 days after we all came together the first time? Now, we did get the music in advance, and that helped because I did run through it. I was astounded that the large ensembles and the small ensembles could come together. I had never been part of a flute ensemble, and that was wonderful. The evening activities were wonderful. So it really was a great combination of learning and fun and meeting other people who shared this intense interest in making music. It was just fantastic. I'm already signed up for Cincinnati. I'm not sure I'm ever going to miss another one.
That is wonderful.
If I wasn't on an airplane, I would probably bring my ukulele as well, because that group was having a really fun time.
And FYI, if a person like yourself who comes via airplane to a camp, which is wonderful, and you need something like a ukulele or a stand or something that is just hard to take in your hand luggage, let us know, because we'll make sure to find one for you. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your volunteer work at the Museum of Making Music?
The Museum of Making Music is part of NAMM headquarters. NAMM is a trade association that represents the music industry, the people who make and sell instruments. They have a museum as part of how they share what they do with the public. So this is a museum that is run entirely by volunteers. There is a staff, but it's very small. But the people who are in the museum as gallery attendants and at the store, leading tours, they are all volunteers. We go through a very intense training on the various instruments that are in the museum and backstories and that kind of thing. What I do is I'm a gallery attendant, and I go around and help visitors and answer their questions, and it is really a lot of fun. I do feel that I have been training for this volunteer job all of my life because of all of the instruments that I have played. There are older people who say, "Oh, I really wish I had played an instrument when I was a child." And I'm so happy to be able to let them know that that opportunity has not passed them by, that they can join the New Horizons Band or North Coast Strings, which is our stringed instrument counterpart that we also have at the museum. I don't ever want adults to feel shy or that learning to play music is something that they can't do as an adult, because you certainly can.
Your story is a story of having music in life really from the very early beginnings. And now you are also the catalyst for other people to pick up that instrument and not to be shy about it. And I wonder whether there are any instruments that you are still longing for trying.
Yes. So my first instrument was a keyboard instrument, and then I went to a woodwind, a non-reed woodwind instrument, and then I went to a stringed instrument that didn't have a bow and percussion. And then I had a non-valved brass instrument and a valved brass instrument. So I believe there's two left. One is a bowed stringed instrument. So violin, I think, will be my next one in a couple of years when I turn 70. And if I still have time, I will probably end up with a reed woodwind. So clarinet or saxophone.
Well, Diane, I would like to thank you for giving such a brilliant interview. It was an absolute pleasure having you here. And I'm really looking forward to making a lot of noise with you there in Cincinnati in June of 2024 at the NHIMA Band Camp. It'll be a whole lot of fun.
I'm so glad I'll be seeing you there, Irene, and I know you play flutes. I'm sure that we'll have time together and with all of the friends that we've made there since.
For sure. Really looking forward to it. Thank you so very much.
You're very welcome.
I would like to thank Diane Scholfield for giving this interview. If you would like to find out more about Diane Scholfield's New Horizons Band in Carlsbad, California, please go to www.museumofmakingmusic.org and look for the New Horizons Band under their Education tab. Music for this podcast by Mary Riddle. Swag on. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Music Forever. If you are interested to be interviewed for this podcast, please email us at NHIMA podcast@gmail.com. That is NHIMA podcast@gmail.com. See you next time.